Hey everyone, welcome back to a new video. This one is kind of tough to make, but I have to address the controversy. I know everybody who subscribed here has been waiting for so long to hear my side of the story. So I figured I'd do a video explaining how you can actually draw this angle competently. It's kind of an elephant in the room, and it's been that for a couple days now. So I figured I'd jump on the bandwagon and hopefully leech off the trend and get some views here. And along the way, also hopefully help some people and do a bit of teaching here. So I will be going through really sort of factors to consider and keep in mind when drawing extreme angles, but will particularly specifically focus here on this bottom side angle. Now, this video, or at least its introduction here, is not to make fun of this original meme drawing, because I think if I was a beginner, when I was a beginner, I wouldn't have had the courage to actually attempt to draw this angle. And interestingly, there's a couple of things here that are actually decently well done, and maybe we'll touch on that around the very end. Obviously, the joke is that it's badly drawn, along with the caption as well. But I think it's kind of admirable to attempt to draw things that you are uncomfortable with, or things that are inherently difficult to draw. And when it comes to faces, they themselves, irrespective of the angle, are very difficult because they're so recognizable. It's probably, along with figure drawing, the most difficult subject to draw, but then this sort of compounds the difficulty further. So it's perhaps the hardest kind of portrait that you can possibly draw. And any effort, any attempt is, I think, ultimately good. Again, though, I'm going to be attempting to help. So let's begin with a couple concepts that everybody's familiar with and are kind of obvious, but I think are worthwhile restating nonetheless, and pointing out that help when it comes to drawing angles such as these. With the first one being foreshortening. Foreshortening is quite self-evident. Most everybody knows that as things get further away from you, they become smaller. But this, of course, also applies to proportions and increments. So if you have this kind of a model here, this kind of a scheme that most everybody's familiar with, where you have equal thirds for the forehead, the nose, and then from the nose to the bottom of the chin, these all being equal, then naturally you would expect that if you move the camera down and you sort of conceptualize the front of the face as a flat plane like this with these equal divisions, then naturally the further away you get from the first division, the smaller the parts get incrementally. And that's exactly what's going on here. And this is a 3D model that I used, and there's going to be a couple more, and eventually I'll sort of wrap it up. But I think 3D models are very helpful because, well, everybody has a head as well, so you can look at your own head too. But looking at a 3D model, or a sculpture, a statue or something like that you can actually move around, kind of puts things in perspective. It's not like you're just observing a single angle. But in any case, clearly the chin here becomes quite large, the nose becomes shorter, and then the forehead becomes very, very short. Naturally, of course, it's kind of clear as well to everybody that if I just took this head and I applied a perspective to it, like this, it's not really exactly what this view looks like at all. So this is certainly not enough, but it's a starting point, and it's specifically applicable to the base of the head. If you remove all of the features and you completely simplify the head, and envision it as just a flat base, sort of like a mannequin, kind of like this, if we're making a little model, imagining it sort of like this with a flat kind of mask for the face, then this holds true, and it's a necessary first step. And that's what I want to do throughout the video, is build from a very foundational idea further and further with more complexity. So First, you have to foreshorten the features. I think this division of threes is actually more helpful than perhaps using the middle of the head for the eyes, and we'll see why later on. But after that, you also have to consider that the head is actually indeed not flat. It's not a flat plane, but it's actually, in some sense, cylindrical. Now, it's also not a cylinder, so the head is, depending on what we find useful for our construction, at the same time a box, a flat plane, and a cylinder. But that's because it exhibits all of these qualities. And the cylindrical quality is necessary to include if we want to create a believable drawing. And to illustrate that, I've included a couple examples here that are just seen from below. So it's not a 3/4 below angle. This is a little more simplified. But what these photos show us is that the features, primarily the mouth, most obviously, but also both the nose and the eyes, as well as the eyebrows, all wrap around the head. So it's not as if they're flat. I don't know if I got rid of that beautiful model that I created, but it's not like you can just sort of paste the features flatly and get believability that way. You also have to consider that they curve, which is visible both when you're looking at the head from the front bottom view, but as well from a 3/4 view, perhaps even more so. And again, it's true for pretty much all of the features. They don't wrap in exactly the same way. As I said, the mouth wraps a little more than the rest, but you can see the nose wrapping around here as well. And then the eyes, if I just draw a straight line, they don't follow it. They come out at a bit of an angle. And all of these angles and all of the amounts of wrappings are going to be individual to the likeness that you're drawing. So every head, every face is slightly different. Some eyes naturally point down anyway. They have a negative canthal tilt, so they feel like they're wrapping around more. If you have a positive canthal tilt, if you have like cat eyes like this, then if you look at the face from below, the effect of wrapping is not going to be as evident, but the big form idea is still there and it's still present. And again, we can see it also in the brows to a certain extent, which again also depends on the actual shape of the brows. So to draw the face believably from this angle from below, we have to both foreshorten the proportions as well as wrap all of the smaller forms around the big curved form of the face and the head at large. But then when we introduce the 3/4 aspect, that's where the real difficulty comes in. And the difficulty is twofold. For one, it's kind of unclear and difficult to figure out where the corner is when you're using the box model. So naturally, the box has 3 primary planes that we're looking at here. There's a front plane, there's a side plane, and there's a bottom plane. The bottom plane is self-evident enough. You can sort of tell where the bottom of the chin and the jaw is there. That's easy enough to figure out. But the side of the head is actually, I think, where the difficulty lays. And that's the first difficult part. And then the other difficult part is actually including the axes, the perspective angle, and properly indicating it, or in other words, not flattening the head. So to address the first question of where is the corner, it's pretty much the temporal line, and that's a bone, that's a bony ridge on the skull, but you can see it where the angle of the brow breaks like this, and if the person is lean enough, or if the skull structure allows it, then you can also see a plane change there. So that's a helpful landmark to know where the front and the side depart, at least around the upper area of the head. And then where the actual face is and around the chin, it gets a little more muddy, it gets a little more difficult because there's a kind of narrowing, a tapering. Obviously, the head doesn't actually look like this. It's not this model, but the chin is narrow, and there's a kind of connection between the chin and the temporal line, which would be this plane break in here. And that's, in some sense, where the plane break between the front and the side plane becomes less important and less crucial because it's less obvious. So it is present. We can visualize and conceptualize the head as a box, but it's really important to think of the break around the forehead where it's most obvious. And then here it becomes a little less useful again because there's an angled plane break and a form change. So it's almost as if instead of working with a box like this, you carve out, kind of chisel out a piece like I'm drawing out in here. So that would be generally where the corner is. And for the purpose of this explanation, and further than for the purpose of actually drawing this out, it's not exactly critical to know precisely where the corner is. It's more so about the fact that if the head is visualized as a box, it allows you and sort of helps you to place the features on the front and the ear on the side. And we can see here on this box that the edge is angled. This is just naturally what happens with perspective. There is a vanishing point off somewhere this way, but the visual effect of this is that all the features are then aligned along this angled axis. And what people tend to mistake, and the problem that they tend to have, is that we naturally veer towards flattening. And this is going to be a reoccurring issue and a kind of theme throughout this video, is that you will inherently, subconsciously try to draw the head as if it was in a flat view, because we're used to looking at flat views more. We don't usually look at people's heads from these extreme angles, but it's also because we sort of imagine, as almost like symbolically or conceptually, we imagine heads as a front view of the face, not this weird perspective foreshortened view. So what people will tend to do is, instead of actually placing down the diagonal axis, they will place it as more of a horizontal line, and that's often where an issue with alignment arises. So that's the importance of the axis on the one side, and we can see that here if we align certain corners. Now we have to keep in mind again that the face and the features are wrapping, but if you align, for example, the corners of the mouth here or the corners of the eyes, they all are parallel generally, and they follow this angled axis. And this is just, again, something that we have a natural aversion towards. It just feels wrong. And this is what you're going to have to keep correcting in your drawing. You're going to have to keep yourself accountable and ask yourself, what is the actual angle? What is the real angle that I'm looking at? And then later on, when you go to invent, you're going to have to try to replicate that. Now, the axis on the other side is useful insofar as it helps sort of plot out the placement of the ear, which from a flat view, from a front view like this, lands somewhere in between the ear, or rather the brow and the nose like this. So it would be the middle third. And visually, when you look at the head from below, it seems as if the ears are coming down, but really it's just an effect, a sort of a consequence of this angle here projecting its placement. And then if you look at the head from a profile view, it's also important to note that the ear is somewhere in the middle. So pretty much in between the front of the head and the back of the skull, that's where the ear starts, and then it occupies a bit of space here, so it would kind of occupy a fourth in here. And those would be the important things to keep in mind and to watch out for with the box model, and that pretty much concludes the big perspective ideas. And essentially, to put it simply, you just have to think about how proportions foreshorten, and you have to, in some sense, simultaneously visualize the head as both a cylinder, which, as an effect, causes the features to wrap around the big form of the head, as well as visualize it as a box, which, as an effect, causes the features to look as if they're aligning along a diagonal axis, and projects the wrapping as well as the big plane break, if we're looking at the box, causes the ear to look like it's coming down, especially from a front flat view. If you look at something like this, and you go to draw it out, and maybe the nose is there, then the ear falls, if you're aligning it horizontally, sometimes even below the mouth or the nose. Now, from here, I want to delve into smaller form ideas. So this is still largely within the concept or the topic of perspective, but we're looking at smaller and smaller and more detailed ideas as we go along. With the first one being the large planes of the head. And to illustrate this, I wanted to use a profile view, and that is in part because I want you to actually pay attention to the way that the planes of the front of the head, the actual face, are oriented. So, and we can see that very clearly from this angle. And in essence, the profile, if you look at it as a shape, is just a series of kind of zigzagging lines. And from a form angle, it's just a rhythm of upward and then downward facing planes over and over again. So the chin, for example, here has a plane that faces down and then a plane that faces subtly up. And then the lip here has a bottom as well as a top plane, again a bottom and a top plane, the bottom plane of the nose, and then a kind of top plane for the bridge of the nose, the bottom plane of the brow, and then a sort of top plane, depending on the likeness. Some people have more protruding and some people have smaller or more kind of retreating foreheads, but a kind of flat, or for our purpose, a sort of top plane, right? So there's a kind of opposing rhythm happening over and over again. And this is significant because, primarily, really because of the top facing planes. But naturally, as we're having the perspective shift, and as we're looking at this form from below, you can imagine that the planes that are below are going to become more visible, and the planes that are facing above, facing up, are going to become less visible. And I think a good way to think about this, a good way to sort of envision it, is with this little eye and with its sight line. So here, when I look with my eye, let's say this is the eye, and the eye could be much larger. It doesn't really matter that we include a radiation. So I'm going to sort of simplify and say that all of these sight lines are coming straight like this. The bottom plane here is just about this tall, right? And then the top plane is this tall. So this is what you see here. This is the bottom plane, that's its height, and then this is the top plane. But if you look at it from below, and this is effectively the same, I've only gone in and rotated the head, but if you look at it from below, then the bottom plane of the nose becomes much larger. And I know this is very self-evident to some of you, but the bottom becomes larger, and then the top, as you can see, becomes incredibly short. And I think in a sense it's fair to say that the bottom didn't become quite as much larger as the top had become smaller. So the bridge of the nose becomes really, really short. And that, I think, is what often throws people off, because again, we're so used to our conception of the face as a flat front facing view. And that's, I think, the most significant, those two planes are the most significant planes to look at here. It's really the nose, and then maybe on the same level, it would be the brow plane here, the bottom facing plane of the eyebrows, as well as the bottom plane of the chin and the jaw, which, if you look at this from the front, is barely even visible. But of course, from a bottom view, it becomes the bane of your existence, and it's very difficult to actually draw properly. So again, we get the bottom plane here. We get a much, much larger, considerably larger bottom plane of the brow ridge there. We get a larger bottom plane of the nose, but then again, significantly, most visually strikingly, we get, in this case, very little of the nose bridge at all. And of course, this is all dependent on how extreme the bottom angle really is, but this is just a tendency that becomes more and more exaggerated as the view itself becomes more and more exaggerated. Again, the ears also fall down, and as I said, sometimes they can even fall below the mouth. So with that, we're going to move on to look at these two planes, the brow plane and the chin plane, in a bit more detail. Now, I think the brow plane is significant because its use can be twofold. We can simultaneously indicate the wrapping of the big cylindrical form, like this, by just placing it down, let's say like so. And we can also indicate a very large form change within this big head container. So these lines show that we're viewing this cylinder from below, the ellipse is wrapping around, but then the size of it is also reinforcing that idea that the view is a bottom one, whereas here we get the wrapping, and that could actually be one of the very first lines that we make in practice. You can have sort of elliptical shape to contain the whole head, and you can place a line for the brow ridge, and then you can create its size before you even indicate any of the other features. I think it's such a central element of the head and the face that it often serves really well as a starting point. And again, it tells you most of the big stuff. Like it also, of course, if you're looking at it from a 3/4 view like this, it could tell you where the front of the face is, because the break is where the brow angle breaks. So it's sort of like this. So this would be the side plane, and this would be the front plane, and then you could build out the head from there. So it's central, literally, in its position. It's kind of in the middle of the face, but it's also a very prominent, both as a plane and as a big form change. If you think about it, it's not really a feature. Like the brow ridge, along with the cheekbones to some extent, is just the mask that the features are then pasted on top of. So it makes sense then to place the big mask before, at least even the secondary element of the big mask, to place that before the features. And then another significant plane that I think often gives people more difficulty, but is at least less overlooked, because people, I think, tend to miss out on the importance of this, on just literally how, and actually I have an original here. These are simplified planar models, and obviously they have all the big form information, but even ruining them completely, even cropping out the ears, you can still tell what's going on, and that tells us, that indicates that you can use it practically in drawing, in your drawing process. But again, people tend to overlook that. They tend to underutilize the brow ridge, and that's why the face often feels flat, is because there's an actual sort of intrusion and then extrusion, right? They come in and they come out, the brows and the brow ridge. But then the other thing that is a more obvious problem, but more difficult to actually solve, I think, is the bottom plane of the chin. And I want to approach it from two different angles. I want to look at its shape first, and then I want to look at its form. And when looking at the shape, I think it's helpful to just simplify it into a couple distinct angles with clear changes. So you have the chin, and you can consider that a separate angle like that, and then from there you literally just have one single angle. You have, from a profile view, you have a line coming down and then a line coming diagonally forward towards the chin, and this is where you would get the mouth and the nose. So that's all you're working with. And visually speaking, what occurs when the angle gets lower and lower is that this line here, which is the most important one, the one that's sort of coming forward, not the one that comes down, but rather the one that goes towards the chin, that line becomes more and more horizontal after some time actually kind of lining up with the chin, like we have in this model here. This is almost a straight line. And then the angle here, really, if you look at it, doesn't change significantly. It looks about the same. And we can tell that here as well. There's an angle from the ear to where the jaw kind of breaks, where the edge of the jawline is. And it's about vertical, slightly diagonal, similar. But then here, and these are different people, they have different chins, but still this is very steep, and this is pretty much horizontal. And then eventually, and this is where the real difficulty actually becomes, the horizontal angle is now the opposite. So instead of coming down this way, it goes up. But it's really just, again, this one single angle repeating symmetrically. So these lines are about the same, and then this is going upwards towards the chin, which naturally even further reveals the bottom plane. And we can see that in here as well. Obviously, it's really almost horizontal if you actually look at it, but it's angling upward more significantly here based on the perspective and the actual angle of the head. So this is a 3/4 view, and you can imagine, even just by comparing these two, that it's quite a lot more difficult to draw this one as compared to just the flat front bottom view. It's still flatter than the 3/4 one. But one thing that sort of becomes apparent from here, after having looked at the shape, or having really looked kind of at the lines, is that the plane here is kind of distinct in that it recedes backwards. So it's not as if there's just a line connecting the shape like this, but rather there is a separate plane going back this way that actually comes off that angle where the jaw breaks. And that's where the actual form and the depth comes in. So the way that I would approach this, the way that I would draw it is like so. I would start with the, let's say, based on this reference, or maybe even this one, maybe it's better to start with this one. You can start off with the shape that we just discussed, the comparatively simple one, which is flat, right? So you have this shape in here, and then on top of it, you would add the more complex three-dimensional aspect, the actual plane, but also the more complex elements of the shape that is below. Because the shape, even though it's generally triangular, and we can clearly see that, it's then chopped off to be a bit flatter around the chin, like this. And then from there, it breaks. So this right here is sort of what we see as the part that recedes backwards in a lot of these angles, like this, for example, like this, or even looking back here, that would be the part there, or the part there, which we can actually see in the contour of the face in this case. But in any case, then you include the element or the part that goes back, that segment, and then from there, you would just chop out a portion to indicate the way that the form and the shape wraps around the big cylinder of the neck. So that's what this part is for. And then from there, you can kind of, and I think I can actually do this in real time, you can take this shape and distort it pretty much. So I'll actually use the distort here in Photoshop. You can distort it to some extent to fit your drawing in depth. And I think this is a good way of thinking about it. This is a good way of making this a little more approachable. Maybe I need to quite a bit more distorting, but it kind of generally vaguely fits in there, and I could refine it, of course. And naturally, you wouldn't actually draw this way, but this is the thinking, this is the approach. And hopefully it simplifies something that's very daunting and very complex from one angle into something that's a little more approachable when you flatten it out, and then you can project it onto that angle. So here we can see, again, those qualities. There's the flat chin, and then it goes into these two angles, which are now opposite to what we're typically used to. And then from there, we have the jaw, I guess, the part that comes down, and then you have this distinct portion there, and then it wedges. And if this was put in or seen from a different angle, then we would just place it on a plane in perspective and build out from there, at least conceptually speaking. And then, of course, in practice, it may not be as helpful necessarily, but you can think of it that way, and it becomes easier to draw it that way then. And with that, I've kind of concluded most of the big difficulties that people run into when you're looking at the big kind of container for the head. And from there, I think it's good to start talking, at least briefly, about the features. And I want to point out a couple things for each of them that people miss out on, common mistakes, pretty much, or just visually striking characteristics that become apparent when you're looking at the face from this angle. And that's really, I think, a good way to phrase this, so that you can eventually later develop the ability to reliably draw this from invention. You have to understand the form. You have to understand, in some sense, the anatomy, at least insofar as anatomy means the makeup, the parts, and the way they look, their characteristics of the face. But you also have to get yourself used to the appearance of the face from this angle. Because again, as I've mentioned a couple times already, we are so used to the face appearing one way, and in a sense it appears almost completely differently from this view. So you have to keep hammering that into yourself until you actually start trusting it, until you actually stop resisting the angle, for example, or you stop resisting the shortness of the brow ridge, or you stop resisting how much the mouth wraps. These are just things that we naturally are sort of drawn away from. So to talk briefly about each of the features, with eyes, it's important to point out that they are aligned on the axis as we talked about, but of course the axis is not flat. So even if it were flat, it is still foreshortening and receding. So just as the nose, for example, foreshortens, and then the brow ridge foreshortens and the chin is larger, similarly the eyes, if the view is far enough towards a profile, also start foreshortening. So if you had one eye here, you would reasonably expect that the other one becomes a little bit smaller because it's a foreshortened plane turning away from us. Let's say sort of like this, for example. So you'd have one like this and the other one a little bit smaller. But that's not even the whole of it, because again, it's not a flat plane. So in reality, you have a curved form, which serves to further emphasize the foreshortening. So now this eye actually, because it's turning around, and it's not as extreme as I'm drawing it out, but it's just to illustrate the point, this eye almost starts facing towards us more, so it becomes flatter, and by that larger. But then this eye, as it wraps around, starts facing further away from us, based on the form, and so it foreshortens more. It's further along, closer to the silhouette of this cylinder, which makes it in a more intense, places it in a more intense perspective view and a stronger foreshortening. So that's necessary to keep in mind with the eyes, and that's often, in part at least, why you will often have the whole eye obscured by the nose. It's not only that the nose is placed in a weird way that we don't expect, but it's also that this eye might be oriented like this, and this eye might be oriented just a tad bit more angled. There's, again, variety depending on the likeness of the eyes, but it's something to keep in mind, and it's especially important if you're looking for a strong form. If you want to have a dynamic look, then you have to include this, otherwise you'll get flatness. And flatness is sometimes fine. Like, this can also work well enough for some poses or some purposes, but chances are if you're drawing this angle, you want to have it dynamic anyway. Now, when it comes to the nose, I haven't noted anything here, but the most significant thing, again, is that the bottom becomes larger, which we naturally expect, but then the top, the bridge, becomes really, really short. Often, we don't even get to see the top of it, and if we sort of align it horizontally like this, it would be a very short measurement compared to the bottom plane like this. Also, and you can see this in some of the earlier examples like here, but even in flat views, if I could only find them, like some of the first ones we've seen here, the nose will often actually overlap the eyes, even if you're looking at it from the very front. So it just kind of becomes wider. It is perhaps from a front view a little bit wider than the space between the eyes, but because it's closer, it becomes larger that way, and it just overlaps. So sometimes we get it from the front, depending on how large the nose is and how far apart the eyes are, but we certainly get it from an angled view like here. And again, often the eye will be fully covered up. And again, you have to trust your construction. You have to rely on this angle. If you've placed it and you know it is correct, then you have to place the smaller forms on top of it, aligned to it, confined to it. You can't just be like, well, this kind of feels awkward. I don't want the eye to be covered up. Let me just put it here, because then it throws everything out of whack. So that's what I would pay the closest attention to when it comes to the nose. It comes out at an angle, or at least it appears so. And this is something to keep in mind as well, is that from a profile view, you might have a nose that's completely flat like this. You might have a very upturned nose. You might have a hooked nose, and these all appear different. And they're actually significant. They change the appearance from a bottom view. So it's something to keep in mind. But the nose also is just largely triangular, which everybody's pretty much used to. And it also kind of comes to a point here where the nostrils flare out, and that's where you get the angle and the wrapping that's present both in the eyes, and then more significantly, most obviously, in the mouth. And I've actually chosen this reference because we can see the teeth. And everybody knows intuitively that if you open your mouth and you look underneath your teeth, the maxilla, the upper jaw, looks something like this. It's actually very round. And a lot of it kind of goes in towards the head, of course. That's not where the face is. But then the face still does wrap around a portion of it. And that's sort of what's referred to in construction when you're constructing a head as a mouth barrel. And a big reason why there is this barrel-like appearance, and the barrel is to signify that there is a rounding this way, both around the whole head, this is the face here, as well as a bit of a rounding around this way. It's because the teeth, especially on the top, the top jaw, are naturally rounded out in their actual bony structure. So the lips, being soft tissue, just wrap around that. And then the chin will often be much larger than you expected, which is going to often be a bit of a problem, and you can have some tendency away from that, and you might try to mitigate it with like very youthful or female characters. But if the angle is extreme enough, the chin just appears large because it's closer to the viewer. And then the ear, it might be worth mentioning that the ear also becomes shorter, as you would expect. If you look at the ear from the front, it might be something like this in its general shape. But then if you rotate it far enough, it will actually start sort of wrapping around itself. It will kind of look like this from a very bottom view. So it's significantly shorter, just like most of the whole head. And that's, I guess, worth pointing out as well to some extent, that the head, at least the front of it, becomes shorter, but then a lot of that depth is made up by the inclusion of the bottom plane in here. So perhaps the whole shape, if we're talking about the big containing block in, it might not be that much less deep than like a front view. So this would be my front view, and this would be my hyper deep, intense 3/4 bottom view. So it's not like a huge change, but the face itself does become much shorter. It's just that there's a bottom plane in here. And then finally, and I think this is very important and very overlooked, the skull is visually very deep. It goes down much further than you might expect. And this is true for flat views as well. So if you look at the head from a profile view like this, if you look at where the skull is, the skull actually, even though you don't really see it from the front, makes up about 2/3 of the whole height of the head, just the actual cranium does. But then also it makes like a half of the head in the back there after the ear. So it's very big, and if you look at it from the front, you can see that it's less deep, right? But imagine this elliptical form now rotated and seen in 3/4. It's something in between the front and the side view. So it's kind of like this. And then when you put the foreshortened face on top of that, often, like we see in here, the skull actually reaches all the way below the mouth. It's like kind of in line with the chin, and you just wouldn't expect that. It's kind of unnatural to our common conception of where these forms and where these shapes are placed and how they're oriented. But again, that's sort of exactly what the issue is, what the difficulty is with drawing this stuff out. So I think those are all the things that I would point out regarding the features. So just a bit of extra stuff to look for. And now I want to briefly just go over all of these as they're present in this reference by the Pose Archives, just to kind of reiterate. And I think I'll just talk about this view in here. So again, in practice, and I think this is very, very significant, this is often the whole issue of drawing, at least to an extent, is like, how do I draw what is actually there? Or how do I draw the way that things look rather than the way that I imagine they look? How do I draw against my preconceived notions of where things are, how they're oriented, what their shape is? And this is never stronger and more apparent, and it's never more of a struggle against than when you're drawing a face, which you're so used to looking, which you have the strongest kind of preconceived notions and connections to. So I'm pointing out the way these things look. And when you study, that's sort of how you develop your visual library, and you develop the ability to actually replicate this from invention. You have to point out to yourself where these things are and how they look and how they tend to look and how they tend to align. So again, to sort of start from the very top, we have a box. It's maybe not the most helpful thing when it comes to actually practically drawing the head, but it's necessary as a way of conceptualizing it. Perhaps a more helpful way of drawing it would be to start with a containing shape. And this is just something that you develop a sense for over time, like what the actual shape should look like. But more often than not, as I talked about before, the skull goes lower and sometimes as well deeper, further back than you would expect, because we tend to focus so much on the face that we kind of forget about the actual cranium, that the face mask, the face shield is almost kind of attached to. Then from there you can indicate the wrapping, but perhaps it might be better to just indicate the big axes. And to do that when you're drawing from reference, it really helps mostly to look for points rather than trying to connect big features, because again, the features wrap around and the points follow the axis. So for example, here, this wraps around, but then the endpoints of the nostrils here can be used to show the axis. Here again with the mouth, it wraps around very strongly for sure. It's in this area right there, but we can use the points to get the axis again. And if we get sort of the average of a bunch of different points, perhaps the ends of the brows here as well, maybe if we could see the end of the eye, we could use that as well. But in any case, if we put a bunch of them down, or we observe a bunch of them, then it gives us a decently good idea about the sort of general ballpark of what the axis, the big axis, perspective axis of the front of the face is. And then we can generally kind of eyeball it as well for the ear. You could sort of try to follow the edge here. So I guess you could say that the actual break, the plane break, would be something like this, where the side of the face meets the front of it. But it's not really that significant. You have a lot more leeway with the side, because there's not a bunch of features, not a bunch of recognizable features like the eyes on the side of the head, so that's good. But you can use them generally to plot out where the ear would be. And then from there, you would just start refining and sort of keeping these tendencies in mind. The tendencies that I pointed out, which are not by any means exhaustive, but I think are the most fundamental or the most overlooked ones. And you would also keep in mind the tendencies that you yourself discover and pick up on, the patterns that you establish, that you can harken back to when you're inventing. So I would know, for example, that there's going to be a decently vertical angle here for the jaw, but then when it breaks from a bottom view, I'm going to get something that's actually pretty horizontal or even faces up like this. And then I'm going to get something flat for the chin, a flat line that lines up with my perspective axes here. And I can sort of bring, based on the big shape that we talked about like this, I can bring the bottom plane backwards. I can give it actual depth like so, and I can connect that with a kind of round wedging shape like this. And then from there, with the eyes, I'd want to make sure to wrap them both the whole eyes, both of them around the whole mask of the face, but then also the individual eyes themselves, as you can see, wrapping around. And you know, the eye has kind of like two lines like this. They're both convex, I guess you would say. They're both round. None of the eye lines goes like this, but from a strong enough perspective, they both align facing one way, echoing the big ellipse of the cylinder of the head. So I want to indicate that, especially importantly with the bottom lid, because the top lid is sort of aligned that way naturally. Anyway, I can indicate the bottom plane here, and again, it often is much larger than you might expect. The bottom plane of the brow ridge. Then the top of the nose is short because, well, in some sense, as an effect of the bottom of the nose just being very tall, like this, and then making sure to wrap the mouth. But harkening back to what I talked about previously regarding the planes of the face and how there's a rhythm where one plane faces up and then the other faces down, and then it repeats alternating that way. It's very significant as well for really all of the features. Like for example, the top lip will become larger and the bottom lip will become smaller. Then the bottom plane of the mouth barrel here becomes larger. Then the top plane of the chin becomes smaller. The top plane of the top facing plane, so to speak, of the mouth barrel becomes shorter, and so on and so forth. And often, finally, the forehead, depending on its character, more often so with males, will just kind of tank. Like, and you can actually see that here in this reference. The female forehead is often more straight, like this. It protrudes more. Whereas here, we get a more pronounced brow ridge, which emphasizes this diagonal shape. And then the forehead itself kind of is more recessed. So this portion is actually smaller. And if the angle is extreme enough, you might not even see where the hairline begins. It might just be like the forehead overlapping the head, overlapping that line. We can see all of the same stuff going on in here. There's the plane that adds the depth to the bottom of the chin. Everything is wrapping. We don't see any of the eye, and that's important to keep in mind as well. And sort of, as I sort of mentioned in the beginning, maybe something to analyze with this drawing in here. The nose is just inherently very small. Just the way that this face looks. So maybe it wouldn't overlap the whole eye, and the eyes are big themselves as well. But the way this would actually look, and it has a bit of that quality already going on, but if you were trying to be consistent, you'd have to, based on this angle, and this is something that you develop a sense for through doing a bunch of drawings. It's a kind of almost like a visual library thing, but you'd probably get a much steeper angle here. So you would probably be working with something like this. We would get the wrapping of the eyes, and then we'd get a larger nose. This might even be more foreshortened. It might look something like this. This would be very large, so I can actually, for this anime likeness, I can actually do something like this, and that would work pretty well. Then the top plane of the cheek often also becomes foreshortened, so there's this kind of sometimes an exaggerated cheek shape, and you can kind of see it in here, like it becomes kind of steeper than it would otherwise look from just a standard three-quarter view. And then from there, the chin is just too small. This is something that we talked about as well. It's just something that you're naturally struggling against. The mouth might wrap more like this, and if you want to avoid the mouth looking like it's frowning when it wraps, then just point the corners up like this, and the problem is kind of solved. So and it is inherently there still, like it does feel a little bit like the mouth is frowning in any case, but you can see both here how the corner comes up, and I think even here as well, just a little bit, even a very tiny angling up helps a lot. So I would probably do that for the mouth. If I want the character to still be smiling, I would point it down, and then I would point it up a little bit. And then here's where the difficulty is. This is not going to be a good paint over anyway, but probably something like this, a much thinner neck. But one thing that's really good here, that's done correct, is the depth of the skull. The skull would actually probably be this deep. This is a small face, so let me resize it a little bit. And then the ear would probably be further back this way. So I might end up doing an actual like proper version of this, like a proper drawing. What I will certainly do is a demo on Patreon as a sort of part 2 of this video, but it's just a little quick review of what I would change. And I think maybe even more importantly, more interestingly, what is already good, what is already working in this drawing. But with that, I want to wrap up this video by talking about how you can practice this. Now, I've been drawing for about 10 years now, professionally for about 5, so like a half a decade, which is very long, and I have a hard time doing this. This is just difficult. Like I talked about in the very beginning, this is hard to draw. There's no way around it. It's always going to be hard to draw, pretty much. Or at least, you know, all things seem to point that way. Probably maybe in another 10 years, it won't be that hard for me, but it's gotten easier and I've gotten better at it. And these are the things that I would do. And I think you need to have a healthy, sort of varied mix of different exercises to get the most out of this. And again, your goal here, which is important to state to yourself and to be conscious of and to focus on, is yes, to draw, obviously, and to gather mileage that way, to have a bunch of drawings done. But specifically, it's to figure out these tendencies, to pick up on them, and to internalize them so that you can eventually apply them when you're inventing. So it's not enough to just replicate the reference, but you have to sort of have an internal dialogue. At least that's the way that I study, and that's what's helped me the most, is to tell yourself, often pointing it out in writing, especially if you're working traditionally. I'll often leave little notes for myself. Like I'll say, for example, this is wrapping, or the corner of the eye is overlapped by the nostril here. And that just reinforces and solidifies this tendency, this pattern, visual pattern that happens in my mind, so that I can then eventually replicate it. And there's, I think, different ways that you can draw this. I found working from 3D reference, whether it's an actual, like a sorrow head, like a physical little thing, or from Sketchfab, stuff like that, I found that really, really helpful because it allows you to monitor the changes. It's like I sort of said, for example, and obviously, the bottom of the nose, the bottom plane of the nose becomes larger as you view the head more and more from the bottom. We all know this intuitively, but how much and in what exact way? And if you do a bunch of drawings, almost as if you're animating a head turn, then you actually really can delve into the intricacy of this particular problem, and again, internalize it and kind of solve it for yourself. And I think that's really a result of focus. So in all of these, I said you have to focus on your goal, but you also have to focus and zero in on figuring out this one problem at a time. So we're not trying, for example, to get a good, crazy likeness. We're not trying to necessarily have the drawing look exactly like the model. We're trying to figure out big form ideas, especially when you're working from 3D reference where the likeness really doesn't matter so much. And perhaps even more so if you use simplified 3D ref. Like again, on Sketchfab, you can find different Loomis model or different, like I've shown earlier in here, different simplified plain versions of the head. And that's very helpful because it removes the superficial stuff that might be distracting. And so you don't have to worry about hair. You don't have to worry about even some of the features like the eyes. You can just focus on the big stuff, and then the smaller stuff naturally is placed on top of it, but it can't function well without previously having established the underlying big forms properly. And in the pursuit of that, I think doing quick sketches is also a really good exercise, perhaps the best out of all of these, especially if you're not experienced with drawing heads in general, or specifically drawing difficult angles. And you could do this with photos, but you could also just as well do it with 3D reference, where you're drawing small or drawing zoomed out, drawing simple, trying to just get the basic blocking of the big structure of the head. Sometimes, if you're simplifying that far, even without including any of the features, I think that's still a very solid exercise to build on top of. If you're more experienced, you might not need to go as simple or as far. And regarding how you could practically go about it, you can time yourself. I've done that. I don't do it so much anymore because you're sort of trying to figure stuff out, and the timing is really practically meant to stop you from overdoing it, stop you from detailing. So it's a way of enforcing simplicity. It's forcing you into a more constructive or a more gestural approach, less literal approach, because you literally don't have the time to draw out the details. But you can also just as well do that yourself without the artificial time barrier. So you can be more careful, more studious, more meticulous, while still coming out and doing the exact same drawings effectively. They would pretty much like look the same, so to speak. And then obviously the other side of this, apart from working with 3D reference, this is like sort of what everybody mostly does, is drawing from photos. I think that's helpful, but perhaps not if you're more of a beginner. It is a good litmus test for how good you can actually, effectively perform, but it might not be the best thing to use to build up your understanding, to actually build a solid foundation, because it's so difficult. So it can be overwhelming. And then, of course, I think all of this is sort of maybe not exactly null and void fully, but certainly less effective if you're not doing any invention at all. So you have to draw without reference, and all of these are from, except from for these two, they're from like a year ago. So I'd probably do a slightly, I don't really like these, I'd probably do a slightly better job now, and the progress is, even if you're more of a beginner, it's often very incremental, but it doesn't even matter, really. And if the faces end up looking unappealing, for example, that's fine. When you're inventing the faces and you're trying to get a handle on these difficult angles, you can't then at the same time expect that you'll do very cool, very good looking faces, or that you'll be able to control their likeness at all, their character. So just focus on the one thing. And again, sort of harkening back to what I talked about at the very beginning of the video, it's important that you put yourself in the fire and do the stuff that's very uncomfortable to you. And while there are mitigating techniques, so to speak, like you can do these simple constructions, you can build up, ultimately you will have to eventually just draw the thing that you're bad at, and you will have to be bad at it for a long period of time. You're gonna have to eat shit, kind of, to get good at it. So you have to kind of be at peace with the fact that, my drawings are kind of ass, they kind of suck, it's fine. I'll focus on learning, I'll focus on understanding what I'm drawing. I won't focus on just making a good drawing and spending an unreasonable amount of time on every single one. And I will have faith that they will get better over time. But if you avoid drawing this difficult stuff, it never gets better, and it never gets easier, because you're not going through the uncomfortability. So that's a little pep talk. That's a little sort of motivational speak to end the video with. I'm not really sure. I think this is going up on YouTube, and then I'm pretty sure as well, probably by tomorrow, I'll do a real-time demo, actually drawing out probably this exact angle. Maybe there's going to be a bonus angle as well, but a real-time demo walking you through how I would draw this from reference and then from invention as well. So if that's something you're interested in, you can check it out over on Patreon. I don't know if this is going to be the only video I post for the next couple of years, or maybe I'll try to post here more frequently, but certainly if you want to encourage me to post more here, spend more time making these types of videos, then support on Patreon is the best way to do it. So you can check that out in the description. And with that, thank you for watching, thank you for your attention, and I will see you in the next video.